This is the untold story of the Smurl haunting in Pennsylvania. Small episodes of strangeness began to manifest. Tools began to disappear, only to reappear hours later in different spots. Old stains that covered the walls began to seep through the fresh coats of paint, and several appliances in their kitchen had mysteriously caught fire, even though they were unplugged. The family would also begin to smell awful odors, like an omnipresent floating cloud of rotting meat that hung over them, only to disperse mere moments later. The stains that had previously been painted over began to seep through yet again, and new stains began to appear as well, with several appearing on the hardwood floors of the home. As the days progressed, the oldest Smurl child soon began to experience the presence as well. She would often be woken up in the dead of night, frozen with fear and unable to move. She would see translucent figures standing above her or at the edge of her bed, staring and watching her. And although it wasn't exclusive to the midnight hour, the activity seemed to pick up at night. Often, when Jack was at work or gone, Janet began to have violent and sickening encounters with a being that she couldn't see. She began to be molested by an unseen force. These interactions left her hysterical, feeling violated and unclean. The family's radio began to turn itself on and off, typically at strange hours, and almost always when the family was trying to sleep. The sinks in their bathrooms began to turn themselves on, pouring what little money they had left literally down the drain, and their toilets began to flush by themselves. The sounds of footsteps began to be heard all throughout the house, and even on the insides of the walls. Drawers began to open and close by themselves. And coupled with these happenings was again the stench of rotting meat, what the family would begin to describe as the dead smell. Except instead of dissipating almost as soon as it was detected before, or in one particular area of the house, the smell would permeate all throughout the house and would linger for minutes, or sometimes even hours. Up until this point, Jack hadn't been targeted, so to speak. But one night, when he was trying to get some sleep after a long day's work, his side of the sheets were pulled from his body, and the sensation of dozens of hands touching and grabbing him ensured that not only was he not going to get the rest that night due to sheer terror, but that perhaps his wife had been telling the truth. One morning, while the majority of the children were at school and napping, and the rest of the adults were out, Janet was headed to the kitchen to pour herself a freshly brewed cup of coffee. As she turned around the corner, her blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of the kitchen, with a stain seeming to materialize directly underneath it, it was a translucent figure with hollow eyes. Frozen in place upon seeing it, as if she blinked, whatever this creature was gone. Janet again would continue to hear her name being called out. No one else was there. Over and over and over again. Couples do argue, and some fight, but these fights were something else. Jack's parents began to hear yelling and screaming, sometimes even items breaking, coming from the other side of the duplex where Jack and Janet lived. These fights became so violent that not only did they think their marriage was collapsing, but they began to become concerned for Janet and the children's safety. One night, Jack's father couldn't take it anymore. He walked from their front door to the other side, and with the fight still raging, he threw the door open, and to be greeted with silence. The entire family was asleep. Shannon Smurl, who was only 7 years old during this time, would be the next target. One day, as she casually walked through the kitchen and into the dining room, a large glass light fixture fell and crashed into her, cutting her and raising the alarm bells for the entire house. Shannon would continue to experience strangeness of her own as well. In her diary and later, she would recount that oftentimes she would wake up and find herself floating above her bed. Some nights, while floating, she would suddenly be thrown across the room and into a wall, so much force that she thought she would be crushed. The climax of these attacks on Shannon happened one night when she woke up to find herself floating once again, but instead of being let back down or smacked into a nearby wall, her door was flung open and she was thrown out of her room and down the stairs. Alongside the intensified attacks on Janet, she too would begin finding herself woken up in the middle of the night, floating in the air, and sometimes, horrifically, she would then also be assaulted. Not a day would go by without the family hearing scratching noises coming from within the walls, or deep, drawn-out breaths coming from behind them. Jack began to experience horrific visions of the creature at work. Several of the other girls were also visited by this sickening presence at night. The demon also began to physically attack the family more often, causing stinging scratches and cuts on their bodies at random times, as well as deep and bruising bite marks. Janet was woken up by a hand reaching up through her mattress and grabbing the back of her neck, pulling her towards it and choking her. Jack would experience something truly terrifying and new. As he woke up in the early morning to get ready for work, he began to gather his things for his workday departure. He came down the stairs and was greeted by a disgusting and horrid creature. Standing in front of the door was a monstrous being whose head almost touched the ceiling. It resembled a horrible amalgamation of a man and a pig, standing upright on two legs. It screeched and rushed towards him, but as he fell backwards onto the stairs, hurting his back, the creature stood over him, face to face, snarling, before it disappeared